Great. Welcome, everybody, to today's session on the Safety Roundtable. Great to see so many of you with us on Zoom, and hopefully the gremlins are not stopping this from going live, but if it does, then I apologise if you were expecting to see
I'd
us
love one,
live.
actually. Well, I'm going to listen to it.
I'm just going to mute everybody. Thank you for joining. I've got a great guest today in Carla. I'll ask Carla to introduce herself in a second. And we're going to be talking all about risk perception. So we'll talk a bit about what that means first, and then why we think this is an interesting topic. And there's something drawing on the screen. There's all sorts going on today. This is going crazy. And then we'll get started. And as always, this is going to be an interactive session, so there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to come and chat with Carla and I. I don't know how to remove this drawing from the screen, so we'll just have to put up with it. Does that work? Eraser? Oh, there we go. Perfect. So if you've not been to the Safety Roundtable before, these are fortnightly sessions which I host either on my own or, like today, with a guest, and we cover a different topic each time. So, of course, I specialise in the field of slip safety, but we don't just bang on about that again and again and again. We talk about anything and everything under the sun in the broad realm of safety and risk management. If you've got any suggestions for guests or topics you'd like us to cover, then please drop me a line and let me know, and I will certainly be happy to pick that up. The idea is it's a roundtable, it's an open discussion. So Carla and I today are going to start talking about this topic, but then we'd really love for you guys to get involved and join in the discussion with us. So without any further ado, I'll say welcome, Carla, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Christian, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk about risk perception today. So I'm Carla Crocombe. I'm the founder and managing director of Safety Rocks. I've been a safety professional for over 25 years now. And we, as an organisation, we tend to focus on truly tailored organisational training and auditing and things like that. But we focus a lot on the area of risk. And we develop truly tailored solutions for organizations so that they can improve their culture and also the impact that they have on their staff, and obviously the risk management of the organization. So we tend to focus on all of those kind of bits and pieces. And this topic is such a hot topic because it's all about people. And I think Christian and I, we know that our world, as much as we can teach people and all the rest of it, it still comes down to human beings, and human beings are inherently prone to failure. It's a sad fact, but that's what it's all about. And so this topic of risk perception and things like risk appetite within organizations are really important for us, because understanding that helps us understand what we need to do to make an improvement. And that's what we're always striving to do, aren't we? To get that continuous improvement. So that's what it's all about.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, yeah, we had a quick chat and we thought this would be a great topic to discuss. So, yeah, please, if you're joining us on Zoom and you want to ask us a question or give us a comment or share an example or anything like that, you can go to reactions, raise your hand, and then I'll kind of invite you up to chat to Carla and I. If you're following us on LinkedIn, for example, then I'm monitoring that as best I can. And I'll try, if you've got any comments or questions you want to put into the chat there, then I will try my best to get those covered as well. But for the best experience, come and join us on the Zoom. So should we sort of talk a bit about what we mean first? So what do we mean by risk perception? How would you define it, Carla?
I would tend to define risk perception as the way we see risk and the way we think about it on a day-to-day basis. So we tend to, as individuals, tend to focus on fast thinking. So when we're thinking about risk, what we tend to do is make decisions on the hoof, as it were. We do this on a day-to-day basis. So Christian, this morning, if you've got up, have you put your socks on? Did you decide to sit down when you put your socks on this morning?
I didn't put any socks on today.
Oh, you are sockless.
I'm working from home, so there's no socks. But I did put some underwear on, and I do have some shorts on. People were pleased to hear, so I'm not naked below the waist.
Brilliant. That's good. But if you think about all that stuff to do with getting dressed of a morning and crossing the road, it's something we do inherently as human beings. We're always assessing risk. But the way we see it is hugely affected by certain things. If we're ill, ultimately, if we're stressed, think about some of the things we've done when we're stressed. We're affected by hormones, we're affected by emotions, we're affected by experiences, and all these things shape the way we see the magnitude of an outcome and also the chance of something bad happening. Now, we know risk, if we look at the definitions, comes with two things really. It comes with opportunities as well as threats. But really, for organizational purposes, we tend to see risk from that kind of outcome basis and looking at the negative thing, because that's what we're trying to control. So when we're looking at perceptions, we take into consideration both the opportunities. If you think about during COVID, people were selling, hand gel for £500, and all the rest of it. That's an opportunity from a risk. But ultimately, we also have to look at the threats, and that is a human thing. We're constantly perceiving it in different ways, and we all see the world differently. I don't know about you, Christian, but when we were younger, I used to think everybody thought the same way, and that we're all the same. But actually, as you get older, and especially when you teach, you suddenly realize that everybody thinks in an ever so slightly different way, and they process that their cognitive function is completely different.
I certainly remember that from a financial risk perspective, I always thought as a kid, if only I could earn like 25 grand a year, I'd be absolutely minted, and I'd be so rich, and I would, that would be my life solved. And obviously, that wasn't. I mean, obviously we've had inflation since then over those many, many, many years since I was a kid. But yeah, that's one example, isn't it?
It is one example, and our perceptions over time change. So things change our perceptions, the life experiences that we have, the things that we see, the things that we are faced with, illness, that we have, and that affects our capacity to look after ourselves, and make decisions based on personal security and safety. All of those things have an impact on us. And we do remember all of those things and we process them. And that's what makes up some of the human decision-making process. Because when we talk about, what is human nature? Sometimes you'll look at philosophers and philosophers talking about, are human beings inherently good or are they inherently bad by nature, and all of those kind of things. And all of these kind of aspects feed into us talking about why we perceive risks the way we do and what we can do to make that better. And I think that's the kind of flow for today, isn't it? To try and look at what we can do to make it better in organizations.
And the difficulty is, as you've identified there, that this is a very individual thing. So even let's take myself and my brother. We've got the same DNA, the same upbringing, up to a certain point in our lives, and then we've kind of gone off and done different things. But the way that we would look at something from a perspective of risk is going to be totally different, even though we've got that kind of shared history, because there is some divergence. So as close as you can be to people working in the same organization day after day, you're still going to have these individual differences. And I suppose that's a particular area of challenge.
Absolutely. And I think what we want to do is get that confluence. We want people to come together. So if you think about an idealistic solution in an organization, it would be to have that coming together of people so that they have the same view. And we don't want to stop people having different opinions, because actually when it comes to risk management, that's really important. If you've ever looked at some of the literature that's out there with reference to different diversifying of opinions and all the rest of it, it's very good to have different opinions and bring different things to the party, especially in organizations, because that actually does breed better ideas, better curiosity, more forward-thinking organizations. But when it comes to risk management, rather than the divergence, we actually want people to come together. So that confluence is going to be really important for us, because what we want to do is get people to try to perceive risk in a systematic way. After all, how can you ever get consensus unless people in an organization agree at some point. And this comes back to the point of risk appetite, doesn't it? Because in organizations, at some point, they need to take responsibility for what risks they're willing to take, and they can't do that without information. But on a day-to-day basis, everything is now so fast-paced, isn't it? We've got all of this information coming to us, and we make fast thinking decisions. We do, and we underestimate things like severity because of it, because we don't process all the data, and we forget that our bodies and our brains are always constantly being attacked by data, as it were. We're always giving information, and we're always making decisions. Hence the conversation about socks. If you get up of a morning, have you sat down when you put your socks on? Although not today. And the data from previous incidents or base rate data can be skewed. We might make decisions. If somebody says to us, by the way, there's an 8% chance that you're going to have a heart attack today, we might go, yeah, but I do this to mitigate it and I do that to mitigate it. But in reality, if we have that data, we may underestimate the level of severity and what that actually means to us. There's so many different things that come up when we're thinking about risk perception. People, for example, people like patterns, don't they? We like patterns, and if you think about on a day-to-day basis, that pretendency that we have to like patterns actually can lead us astray. It can give us the incorrect information.
Patterns and habits.
Patterns and habits. And one of the strongest things I think that comes up when it comes to risk, and especially when we're teaching, is emotion. And I find this really interesting because risk and outcomes are all a form of logic, aren't they? So it's all tangible, it's all logical. And on a day-to-day basis, that's what we have to do. We have to look at logic and whether or not something is tangible. But so many people bring their emotions into their risk perception. If you think about in the NHS, on a day-to-day basis, their decision-making processes are often not based on logic. They're often based on the fact that there's an element of emotion attached to some of those things as well. So there's so many reasons why we misjudge risks. And after all, it is that bit. We are all human. We are all inherently prone to failure.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's loads to unpack here, isn't there? And again, if you want to get involved with Carla and I, just go to Reactions, raise your hand, and come and have a chat with us. But I suppose what's interesting to me is that we make these dynamic risk assessment decisions day in, day out. Crossing the road, driving is a massive one. There's huge risk in driving, but we don't think anything of it because we're just doing it and we're used to doing it and we've done it so many times. So we are making these decisions, and more often than not, we're making I don't know if we're making the right decisions, but we're making decisions that are not causing catastrophic outcomes. So therefore, I suppose they are the right decisions. But yet, sometimes we make the wrong decisions. To what extent do you think that we can overcome this in your experience? Or are we always going to have some things going wrong because of this gap in perception?
It's an
Rob says I've obviously not driven in Saudi Arabia. That is true, Rob.
Yes.
I haven't driven in Saudi. I've driven in Italy though, and that's bad enough.
Yeah, and in places like Dubai and places like that, so it can be quite crazy in terms of driving. But I think it's an interesting question about how much we can overcome it, because if we think about human nature, our ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, and our fundamental disposition, our characteristics are what kind of create human nature. And if we think about overcoming human nature, we have to think about what our individual risk beliefs are and our capacity individually to be rational. Are we outcome focused rather than based on the factors that cause the outcome? What do we do in terms of all of the kind of aspects? And in terms of overcoming human nature, it can be really challenging. But I think one of the key things about it is making sure that we understand. So when we go out there and we're chatting to people and we're talking to people about their own brains, we need to find ways of getting them to understand that their brains will do all of this stuff automatically, that you will have biases and you will have shortcuts, you have your heuristics and you have all these things that we do automatically. We know, how many times have you driven a car, Kristen, and not remembered the entire journey? We've all done it, haven't we? We've all done it. So if on a day-to-day basis, if we had to genuinely face the cognitive burden of all the things that we have in our lives, face on, reflective on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure our brains would go, they would just literally explode with all the things that we need to do. So there's some stuff that we do automatically, which is just very by the nature of what it is, but we need to be more reflective. So risk involves looking at what is tangible, what is rational, and that involves so many different aspects, and looking at different aspects and understanding those biases. So teaching people about what is human nature, what are our beliefs about risk. And if we've got these beliefs about risk, they often reflect our own systemic beliefs about our lives and things like that. So when you talk to people about risk perception, they will get a different answer from people, because it will be what they believe in their life. So that it's so ingrained and intertwined. But if we educate people about the way their brains work, and we don't tend to do that very much, but we can show them, we can give them examples. So sometimes we did the example that we did at the health and safety event, where we made them read the kind of phrase and then count the numbers of letters. How many people got that wrong? Safety professionals have been doing the job for years. They missed whole rows of letters because our brains create shortcuts, and it's just by our very nature what we do. And so if we educate people, we know that then we can not overcome our nature, but we must work with it and develop it. I think that's the key thing about the stuff to do with risk perception.
Yeah. Lisa has put in the chat something that I was keen to speak about, which is, she said, people do not genuinely believe anything bad will happen to them whilst undertaking most activities. Therefore, they have little or no perception of risk. And this is something that I think is really, in terms of health and safety and keeping people safe in the workplace, a really big challenge that we have to overcome. My experience is that if you, let's say in my world of stopping people from slipping over, you go and speak to a kitchen porter in a hotel. If you try and speak to this particular person about keeping themselves safe from slipping over in that kitchen, they're going to think, well, I've worked here for 10 years, I haven't slipped over, I'm going to be fine, and I take care anyway. And even if I do slip over, I won't get hurt. And, all these things sort of layer on top of themselves. And so their perception is that they're kind of bulletproof. I've found often the best way to get through to that sort of person is, don't speak about what might happen to them, because I don't think it will. Speak about what might happen to someone else that they work with, who they care about on some level. And that seems to be a good way of kind of unlocking, because you can almost sort of then detach yourself from, I've worked here for 10 years and it'll never happen to me, to, well, they have worked here for 10 years, but it could happen to them, because there's this kind of overconfidence or maybe even arrogance that bad things won't happen to us.
It's interesting, because I've just seen something that's come up there about context. It absolutely does play a part in our role on risk perception, without any shadow of a doubt. And so does the human nature aspect. This bit about our abilities and our capabilities. And also, I read a paper by a chap called John Edward Terrell about the human high five, and actually what is human nature. And it's about us fundamentally having 5 things that are really important to us as human beings, and what defines us as being human beings. And if you look at that human high five, the things like the caring for our young, and the fact that when people have children, they all of a sudden become unbelievably risk averse about everything, because they have responsibility. So responsibility plays into that. And then the bit about the social learning aspect, so learning and teaching others. We, by our very nature as human beings, like to learn from each other. Well, most of us do. We learn. Every day is a school day. We're always constantly learning. And also that ability to teach others. And finding that personal connection is really important when we're teaching others. As you said, how can we make that relevant to the individual? If you look at Vroom's theory of motivation, if you tell somebody how to do it, why they need to do it, unless there's a personal reason for them to do it, you've got hell or no chance of them doing it. So again, that goes back to the kind of human nature aspect and the social network. So people like to be emotional with people. They like to be, have, productive and have an enduring life and all those kind of things. And they like to imagine and have a fantasy life and have collaboration with others and all those kind of bits and pieces too. That makes us up as being, that's what it constitutes us being human. Somebody's just put, there's a religious aspect, the bit about, the gods will, gods will decide whether or not I live or die. That's not tangible. That's not logical at all. So we're saying on one hand that risk actually is tangible and logical, but somebody's saying, well, it won't happen to me because, this particular God will save me, or this particular deity, all those kind of things. So does being clever make us wise? We're not entirely sure that it actually does, but in the same token, what we can do is try to connect with the individuals within an organization and to make sure that people understand what risk actually is, that bit about defining risk, and then making sure that they understand how their brains work. And actually that may be a completely revolutionary to people who want training with organizations, this bit about teaching their staff how their brains actually work, because they might go, well, that what's that got to do with making the world a safer place? But absolutely fundamentally does. If you think your brain is a bit broken, all of a sudden you might start to think in a slightly different way. And our brains aren't broken, they just shortcut so many different things, and we inherently have all of these biases. So it's quite, if we can perceive risk better and we can think better, ultimately that improves risk management without any shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. Ian, I saw you had your hand up and then you took it down. I don't know if we've covered your point or if you want to come in, but if you do, then feel free to do so.
Yeah, no, I suppose my point is, I think traditionally we know risk perception and risk management is, so we talk about the training, education, etc. But then we kind of went down a road of, how individuals perceive risk, and then we talked about, so for me, I suppose I've worked in two previous or a few roles that were high risk. And one of the key factors for me is the complacency. Do things repetitively over a frequent period of time, we all become desensitized. And there's lots of analogies I'm sure we've all heard, when you're standing on a rail platform and a high-speed train comes past you, we will jump, but the guys that all work there just stand there continually chatting, right? And when I worked for an NGO and I worked with critically endangered animals, within that, people start believing those lions, those tigers, those gorillas and primates are all of their pets because they work with them daily and they build a trust and they have these beliefs. So I think the interventions is that human factor about those kind of, how do we then bring that risk back to reality, that actually this tiger in its DNA is designed to kill you, and it's unpredictable, but you have to work with it every single day and move it, clean it, and so those are the kind of the complexities of risk. So I think for me, the word I want to continually use is this complacent mindset that we as humans all fall into, and all of those that drive on this call. I don't know about you, but when I first started and got in the car, my hands were tempted to mirror signal maneuver, and I was really nervous. Now I get in it, it kind of drives itself. I'm thinking that I'm multitasking, I'm thinking about everything, and it just gets me there, and I kind of go, wow. And that's the complacency factor within the workplaces and that I believe is where we, if you really want to get down to risk appetite to the individual, not organizationally, because there's obviously different individuals, then you really need to focus on the human factors and those complacencies that sit in. When you do things repetitively over a long period of time, we then become desensitized, and that's when the human factors of accidents really occur. So that was just really my piece. So
yeah. This is why I have an old car, you see, because whenever I hire one of these new cars, they literally do drive themselves. It's like you can do the cruise control and then they'll brake automatically with the car to keep a distance from the car in front of you. They'll tell you if you're going to go into the opposite lane. So yeah, you can easily drift, can't you? There, my old banger. Yeah, you've got to be concentrating.
Weirdly, I think our brains are not designed for step-by-step risk assessment. They're designed to work in a slightly different way, look at relative risk and all the rest of it, and they're constantly reassessing risk on a day-to-day basis. But it's like the roll of dice, isn't it? At what point risk is tangible, it's there, and just because the worst case scenario hasn't happened, immediately when Ian was talking about animals, I was thinking about Hamerton, what happened at Hamerton. When you work with an animal on a day-to-day basis, all of a sudden you believe that they're your pet, and actually that was a tiger, wasn't it? And ultimately, a tiger is not a pet.
No, well, that goes to I was part of that coroner's review, so I
Yes.
know the situation inside out. But I think for me, it is a lot of that was the human factors, lots of multiple failings on it, but the complacency that somebody could go in and things just happen. And it's very difficult as risk professionals because we are enablers. Right. And actually, we're there to do it. And actually, there has to be an acceptable level of risk, right? We just, in the world that we live in, we can't just engineer everything out, so we go through that hierarchy, but there has to be an acceptable level of risk. And that for me is very difficult, but you have to also, discharge that onto people who are working to make sure that they can have those self triggers. When you change lanes in a car, I'm going to give you an example, and somebody toots their horn, you get that moment, don't you? You go, oh, and then you're driving absolutely on point for the next 20 minutes until you kind of become more complacent again. That's how do we get that kind of scenario back into being a bit more proactive rather than the event actually happening? How do we can make sure that appetite, that the kind of risk awareness? And that's very difficult because we do lots of campaigns, lots of training, and then there's only so much that we can.
It's true. We have a short memory, don't we, Ian? I mean, human beings, we have a short memory. If you look at COVID, you look at all the stuff that happened during the pandemic, everybody thought everybody was going to be different. People started buying soap, they started washing their hands more often and all the rest of it. And very quickly, all of that dissipated. And there are more viruses than stars in the world. So not just COVID, and there's some really nasty things that are worse than COVID. And yet people have short memories. So you are quite right. That ability to keep going. It means that the organization needs to have tenacity and they need to constantly find novel ways of communicating, both using rhetoric from stuff to do with the instinctive behavior that we have as human beings, i.e. teaching people about what instinctive behavior is and why we constantly change the probabilities in our own heads rather than it being real probability change. We change probabilities. I was reading an article about this particular theory around goats and around this TV program in the US and around why people would choose a particular door on a TV program, but the probabilities were 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But people perceived that the probability, I think it was called Monty theory or something, about why people chose the door on the left or the right. And again, if we teach people about how their brains actually work and all the different biases that we have and all the different shortcuts that we use, and things like anchoring, when we meet somebody, first of all, we make a decision about them and we don't really want to change that decision. And if we do that, we are in a far better position to kind of pull them back and say, actually, there you go, Monty Hall problem. Well done, Mark. Thank you very much. That was the one, the goat doors. That's the one. Yeah. Absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, it is that bit about having tenacity, I think, Ian.
Yeah, I like that. Interested to know if anybody's done anything that has worked for them. What strategies have you employed, and have you got any examples you could come and share with us to say, well, look, actually, we identified this. Here's something we did, and it seemed to work. Because it's all about sharing good ideas, best practices, etc. One of the things that came to mind to me when I was thinking before this discussion, and it's been echoed in a lot of what we've said, whether it's within a team environment or that idea of religion and common beliefs, is an idea about environment dictating performance. In other words, if we're in this kind of group think space, then we can if we can influence that kind of group and shape that group think, then that will sort of take people down a particular pathway, and that might be helpful in this case. Any thoughts about that, Carla?
I think it's an interesting one because we are often affected by our peers. We know that when you look at group dynamics and you see people go out and do things when they're in a group socially, which they wouldn't usually do if they were on their own. In fact, often it goes against all their beliefs and they'll go and do it because they're led by other people. So if in organizations we understand how that works and the dynamics of that, we can utilize that for our own benefit for positive outcome. And we can say to people, if we've got a group, we can find those people who are good at leading people and take them on a journey to understand how you then influence. There's so many things out there that are really useful, including teaching people about neuro-linguistic programming and how they would use that effectively to do good within the workplace, and a variety of different things. But building solid, repeatable processes improves decision-making processes, and constantly refining them to make them clearer and easier to follow and easier to manage also helps supplement that. So picking the kind of peer, those people who are influential, and finding those people that are influential so they can do the job for us, as it were. Because we're not always going to be there as safety professionals, are we? We're not always going to be in the group.
No, and that point about environment dictating performance, it means not only the culture in terms of the environment, but also the physical environment too. So obviously, the more we can do to mitigate risk and keep people safe from a engineering control perspective, clearly the better. And we should be doing as much of that as we can.
Yeah, things like noise, all those kind of bits and pieces. Noise is the perfect example, isn't it, of like thinking about something that can have a massive impact on risk within an organization in multifaceted ways. So if we can improve the working environment, we know that human beings are inherently prone to failure. So if we can change the conditions that humans work under, then that has more of an effect than changing humans themselves, which is much more challenging and much more difficult for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this overarching question is one that I kind of grapple with all the time in my day-to-day work, obviously, because I'm dealing with an issue that everybody is aware of in terms of slips and falls, but it's something that the perception of it is sort of, it's less important perhaps than other areas. So there's a constant battle even among safety and risk professionals there about, well, what is important, where should we be focusing our time? And I suppose, whilst I might advocate for spending more time on this, there's a very good argument to say, no, spend your time on that. So, even at our level, these perception issues are causing us a challenge as to where we can allocate our finite resources.
So it's another interesting thing that I was reading, as you do, because we're obsessed with risk, aren't we? We know that we're always talking about trying to define risk and making it clear to people. Even when we first start teaching, we always say to people, "What's the definition of risk?" And a lot of time people can't define it. They find it difficult to define it. But I was reading another kind of theory on why people choose quantifiable risk, even if it is less satisfactory for them than unknown risks. So they would rather something be quantified. So for example, when you were talking about slips, trips and falls, we know that the likelihood of slips, trips and falls if you ask any organization, they'll say our biggest number of instances that we have are slips, trips and falls most of the time. Typically. So people, if they have data associated with something and they have a quantifiable risk, they look at they look at things differently, that rather than the unknown unknowns. And it's called the Ellsberg paradox, I think, is like about why people choose things. And it's she was doing this kind of like betting test where if you have somebody who has kind of a known outcome, they've got more chance of them choosing that because the unknown is uncertain. And so if we overcome uncertainty for people, what we can do is get them to make better decisions. So one of my what to do when it comes to risk is to try to overcome uncertainty. If you can give people more certainty, they will make better decisions.
Yeah, I like that. I think that rings true, isn't it? Because you're battling against the certainty in their mind is everything that's happened to them so far in their experience, and therefore, if this hasn't happened to them, then the only certainty that they've lived, their lived experiences, it won't happen.
Exactly. And lived experiences can be very damaging to risk perception. If you think about the guy who's worked on a roof for 40 years, or the girl that's worked on a roof for 40 years, or anybody else who's done that job, they will go, "What are you talking about, risk professional? I've been doing this. Look at my trainers. I've been running across the ridge for 40 years. Nothing's happened to me, love. I'm all okay." But in reality, all of that not happening and there no outcome happening is damaging to people's risk perception. On the other hand, it could be equally damaging the other way. So if somebody constantly has incidents occurring, their risk perception could mean that they become incredibly risk averse. And I know, you're talking about driving. I know many people who will not drive because of the experiences that they've had.
Mm.
So it can be equally damaging. But what we need to teach people is to remove the emotion from risk. It's all
Yeah.
about whether or not it's tangible. Ultimately, we know most commercial organizations cannot run without a level of risk. You wouldn't run an airport, you wouldn't run an F1 team, you wouldn't run a military engineering organization, you wouldn't do any of these things. So we know we can't eliminate all known risk. Once a hazard is part of a commercial activity, we just have to manage it. That's what we have to do. But we have to get people to see what the risk is. And perceiving risk is simply seeing what the risk is, the real, tangible level of likelihood, because it's always tends to be so subjective and different. And that's what I meant about the confluence. If we can get everybody on that river towards, seeing things the same way, you get better decision-making processes when it comes to risk within organization. And also you get clear, you get better adherence to processes, and if they're clearer and more concise, and if you teach people about the way their brains work and you make the details clear, and you teach people about personal exposure and what personal exposure looks like to the outcome. So often we're afraid of going to somebody, this is what can happen, because we don't want to scare people into submission. Nobody wants to scare people, but we do need to show them what the outcome is. And often we're quite fluffy in the UK about this, aren't we? We're like, no, we won't show people what the worst case outcome could possibly be.
Yeah, we're very polite, aren't we? That's the Australians are good at being pretty direct.
They are.
Yeah. Richard, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come and say hello?
Yeah, camera's off because I've got Wi-Fi problems here today.
No
really good point. Really good points made so far. One of the things I would say is when it comes to spending time teaching people about how the brains work and everything of that nature, I think we need to make sure we're directing conversations to the right people. At the present moment in time, I'm spending quite a bit of time training management teams in health and safety in foundries. Most of them don't know truly what their roles and responsibilities are, and don't understand what legislation actually applies to them. If we can use case studies from similar activities, perhaps in other sectors, so there's lots of stuff on falls from height, slips, trips and falls, interactions with machinery, etc. And we can show people, for example, prosecutions by the HSE of other companies, that brings out risk awareness to them. But then they need to learn how to talk to their team. So the example I put in the chat, I was speaking to somebody and they'd got a child coming up, was going to get married fairly soon. This worker thought they were too cool to wear glasses because they weren't smart and trendy. So pointing out, first of all, that we weren't on a Milan catwalk, what the glasses were designed to do, and did they actually want to see their child get married? Because if they had something in their eyes and lost the sight, they've had one of the greatest days of their own personal life ruined, never mind that of the child. I think we have to do much more to explain to people what things mean in the real world, what the real world consequences of things are going wrong, and having those conversations without initially talking about disciplinary procedures, just the impact on their ability to go out to work, pay the mortgage, pay for the car, treat their partner to meals out on anniversaries and Christmas and those sorts of things. That seems to have, in my experience anyway, the greatest driver for getting change. But that's when we get the management teams engaged. It's left to the safety professionals to do this all the time. It's too much of a workload in larger companies. You can't get round and see everybody. There isn't the amount of time to spend in detail explaining to people how the brains work. So as an entity, we need companies to understand how its mindset works, how its overall brain works in terms of thinking and looking after people. That then helps drive all of these other conversations forward in more depth over time. Because the other thing we're really bad at doing is we tell somebody once and then we assume the job's done. We don't keep a constant reminder and activities going on all the time.
I'm going to share something that came in the chat from Noala, which I think is another good example of this. So a young new offshore worker on a drill ship didn't think he needed earplugs. I asked him if he was married or had a girlfriend. No. Does he want one? Yes. Where will you likely meet somebody? A pub or a club? Oh, so somewhere noisy. Yeah. If you can't hear what she's saying to you, do you think she'll stick around after the conversation starts getting frustrating? No. So maybe you should use the PPE. and he wore earplugs every day after that because he really wanted a girlfriend.
Personal,
A great,
personal motivation, isn't it?
great story. But it's all about what's in it for them, because we have our own individual perception of risk and what's tolerable to us and what we perceive as being um, dangerous or not. But we also have our own personal perspective of what are our aspirations, what are our goals, what are our fears, and it's that kind of mesh, isn't it? So I wonder whether actually we need to. This is more a question of maybe from an organizational level of how we can show that we care about people, and then they feel as if they do. The organization does care about me, and maybe that would influence their risk perception a little bit as well.
It goes down to
Adam, you've
culture,
got
doesn't it? It goes down to
yeah,
culture, doesn't it? It's all about culture and that bit, having the conversation around risk appetite and defining risk appetite within an organization is incredibly important, is it? And developing that trust. It's trust. You've got to develop the trust within organizations.
yeah. Adam, you got your hand up.
Hello, yeah, I was pleased that Richard said he couldn't go around an organisation and do all this teaching. That was my concern when Carla was saying we go around. I do agree, we do need to educate and teach people, but from the organisation, the thought of us going around and delivering a load of a training on top of all the existing kind of statutory obligations already and what they've got to do for their own day job training and make them competent to do the work were quite a scary thought. So we do need to think, how do we actually increase the awareness of such an issue across a vast workforce? I don't know the answer. It's something to reflect on. But I was also thinking in that mix somewhere, the latest generation of workforce coming through, the millennials and the Gen Zs, have about a 10-second memory concentration span, don't they? If we can't get a message to them in 10 seconds, they're just not interested. It's that tic-tac mentality sort of, that somewhere in there, I've got to think, how do we educate that sort of generation as well in terms of these sorts of things?
That's an
Sorry,
interesting.
I drifted off there, Adam. I didn't hear what you said. No, I'm joking.
Absolutely.
Go on,
I thought you'd appreciate that remark. Yeah, being from that generation, of course.
Adam, that is such an interesting question, isn't it? And it's such an interesting idea about the stuff. I think showing them, we were saying about educating people about how their brains work. We're not talking about like doing massive rollouts of training here, but just if the teams or if people are coming in to deliver a session on working at height or any of those kind of things, introducing activities in there that are short, snappy, and that actually prove to people the way that their brain shortcuts things, and creating these kind of almost gamification, so that people can perceive that their brains don't actually function properly in the way that they think that they do, not properly, but in the way that they think that they do, and also just making it fun. I mean, and it does. I mean, that game that we did at the health and safety event, it took 60 seconds. So we're not talking about a huge amount of kind of time or energy here. What we're doing is adding this into the agenda and realizing why it's important, because of that human nature and because of the the fact that we all think that we all think that we're brilliant at assessing risk. If you ask people, how good are you at assessing risk, they all go, yeah, I'm brilliant at assessing risk. And Mark's just said, what was the game? And it was literally a statement mark, and we asked people to count the numbers of a particular letter within a period of time. So 60 seconds or whatever it was. In fact, it was 20 seconds. You've got 20 seconds to count the numbers of a particular letter, and it just showed people the shortcuts. And then again, that relates to risk and all those other things, talking about what Richard was talking about, the bit about making sure it's personal for people. All of those kind of things are important, but we're just constantly trying to find better ways of trying to get people to perceive the level of risk.
I think just to put onto that as well, I think the other thing about training initiatives, education initiatives, whatever it is, it's got to be sustainable as well. I'm just because I work in a very compliant-driven organisation. We follow a lot of policies, procedures. I know that a lot of people do. If it's written down, they'll follow it, which is sometimes a different risk issue completely, because they'll say, "Oh, well, I followed that because that's what it said on the procedure." It didn't even do that dynamic risk assessment. It was just we followed the procedure sort of approach. But yeah, certainly in terms of doing one-off initiative, yes, but I think it's sustainable initiatives throughout the lifetime of a worker as well has got to be in there. It can't be a one-off thing. How do you just keep repeating the message throughout a career?
I'm going to say something unpopular in a second, but go and ask that question first, Carla.
I was just thinking about the sustainability. We're always constantly finding novel ways and also looking at research. So I do think that we as safety professionals often don't utilize all of the psychology and the research that's out there. And there is a huge amount of different, things we're talking about. I was talking about the goat theory, the Monty theory, and different things that we can use in order to be able to get our message across in different ways. And Adam was right about, different generations and different demographics see things in a different way. Somebody wrote on the chat there about the fact that, diversity, we have to take into consideration people who are neurodiverse. And again, finding novel ways and constantly change. Our job 100% is part, is tenacity. We are the ones who have to keep going, finding different ways to communicate the message and using evidence to do that. So yeah, it is interesting about the compliance. Adam said about people following procedures blindly, which is another really interesting one as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. So here's my unpopular statement or challenging statement. Do we need to really be introspective and figure this out for ourselves first? What I mean by that is, let's say, I remember once I did a poll on LinkedIn and I said, how often when you take on a new health and safety role do you find things you can improve upon? And the vast majority of people said all the time. And very, very few people said never. So in other words, we go into a new role, we take over from someone else, and we always find things we can improve upon. Are we being tough enough on ourselves about our own perceptions of risk and our own perceptions of how well we've done our jobs at setting up the environment, the policies, the procedures, the culture, and all of that stuff? In other words, are we sort of enabling some of these challenges by not looking introspectively at ourselves and challenging ourselves enough to say, well, hold on, am I perceiving this right? Should I be thinking differently about this? And if I did change and improve, would that have a knock-on effect? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I don't think that is controversial. I think that's right. We should always be pushing forward. We should always be reviewing ourselves. We should have no ego. We should be egoless as safety professionals and say, you know what, it doesn't matter how many years experience I've got. I'm constantly learning. I'll learn something new every day. Am I good at managing risk myself in terms of my perception? Can I do it better? Is there yeah, somebody's put Noela's put always be curious. Yes, curiosity is the mother of all invention, isn't it? And we're constantly finding different aspects. And if we think about 20 years ago, were we really talking about risk and psychology? Probably not. We would just gone hierarchy of control, do this, do that, do this. But now we're going, right, how can we affect the way people make decisions? What can we do to stop people being biased and using shortcuts? What can we do? And so we're always moving forward. You're absolutely right. I think understanding ourselves as humans is the first part, and understanding that we're fallible as well as everybody else. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
I mean, it's axiomatic, isn't it? That the fact is we are inherently prone to failure. All of us.
Yeah. I like Jordan's comment here. As safety professionals, we need to be doing more things with people rather than doing things to people. I definitely agree with that. And I think that's kind of alluding to what I said earlier about the environment, as in the culture, the physical environment, everything that surrounds us influences our behavior and our thoughts and our perceptions and our actions. So the more we can sort of work with people to improve upon that, the better outcomes we should get, I think.
The best part of our job always, or for me, I think the most important part of our job is charm and influence. I think you know that, Kristen. I always think that as much
I don't know anything about charm.
That's what we do. We're always charming people. That's what we're trying to get people to think differently. And you can only do that when you're beside people. You can't do that if you sit in an office and write policies and procedures.
Yeah.
So it's very much being on the ground. We are influencers. You said at the word at the very beginning, we are enablers. But charm is part of what we need to get people to think differently. How can we influence? How can we inspire change in people? That's really important by using our character and our knowledge, but also our ability to change people's perception.
Yeah. Love that. Carla, Are there any, you've mentioned a couple of articles you've read, but are there any other kind of resources or, people to follow that are talking about this on LinkedIn or whatever that you could recommend everyone should sort of check out?
I did think that. I do think that anything. I read quite a lot of articles around human nature, and I do think in terms of looking at a human nature in general and looking at why we do what we do. I mentioned the human high five, and I would
Yeah.
get people to check out John Edward Terrell. So that's John as in spelt normally, Edward Terrell. I think that human high five aspect and understanding what motivates us as humans often ends up helping us understand what we can do to influence humans. Genuinely, I think that was quite interesting for me. I talked about a variety of different theories, and in terms of looking at outcomes in terms of theories and probabilities. One of the books I read was Denying to the Grave: Why We Ignore That Science Will Save Us. And that was by Sarah E. Gorman. And I found that fascinating. So that was quite an interesting book. Again, I love the fact of the diverse thought processes, which is why we love doing these, because people will come with different challenges and different things. But yeah, that was an
Exactly,
interesting
yeah.
one. So Denying to the Grave.
Yeah, love that. And where, Carla, can people sort of get more information about you? Is it LinkedIn? Is it the web? Is it whatever? Where should they
Yeah,
go?
so LinkedIn, you can find us on LinkedIn. We can find me on LinkedIn. So happy to yeah, we'll add the reading list in the chat. Absolutely, we'll do
Yeah,
that. We'll add the reading list in the chat. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. So I'm Carla Crocombe. I'm the only one in the country, so fairly easy to find. um, and
whereas if
yeah.
if you Google me, you get like a running back in some American football college team or something, which is a bit weird.
So if you Google, you get all sorts of different things. And they can also find out more about Safety Rocks at www.safetyrocks.co.uk.
Perfect. I wanted to make sure we got that in because I'm trying to keep this to time. So, but I'm happy still to take some more. Noala, you wanted to come in, I think, with something. Do you want to unmute and
Sure. So just on that whole, our role is about charm and influence. And I went onto a rig offshore and I was introduced as a safety auditor instead of a safety coach. I mean, great place to start.
Yeah.
And it takes time. I mean, even if you're introduced correctly. So for about the first, I think, 2.5 weeks when I was offshore, I would go out on deck and I'm convinced that the guys would on the radio go seagull on deck because I couldn't find a living human being because everybody thought I was out there to audit them. And it was slowly, at lunch and dinner, going and sitting at different tables and having conversations with people and building that rapport that by the end of my rotation, my 4-week rotation as a safety coach offshore, I was having selfies with the deck crew and connecting with them. And it takes time. And I think a lot of companies or a lot of people don't realize that there's no silver bullet to influence and charm and to coming into this. You can't go offshore or into any high risk environment for a week and go, I can make a huge impact. It actually does. It's that creating that environment where people feel safe, that they are not going to be judged, that they're going to be just seen as who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great point because what that suggests is we need to get started, but we're not going to see the effects of it straight away. But let's not sort of look at this as a academic exercise. What we're talking about today, let's look at it as something that we should make some progress on. And actually, we're never going to get this perfect because we can't force people to think in a certain way. So we can't be sort of stopping ourselves about being a perfectionist and procrastinating. Actually, let's just get started with it and make an impact.
Absolutely. We're always on the back foot, aren't we? We're always on the back foot, aren't we? We're always, like Nuala, she said, we're always on the back foot.
Yeah. And really help people have better conversations. Because it's the conversations that will help you think differently about safety.
Yeah.
Was
that someone else that wanted to come in?
Yeah, sorry, that was me again. At a place I worked at in the past, as anyone who really knows me knows, I'm not a football fan at all. But if I didn't know the football scores of all the local teams, I couldn't talk to anybody on the shop floor on a Monday morning if I couldn't either congratulate them on a win or commiserate them on a loss. So I think part of the conversations when we're talking to people at a lower level, or we're talking to operatives who really only want to turn up and work and perhaps don't have the same level of interest, maybe in safety that we do, it's finding the chink in the armor, what opens things up to have the conversation exactly in the sort of way that that Nuala was talking about. We need to find out what's going to drive people anyway. Then the conversations come in really well, because that's exactly the same sort of thing. If you can speak to somebody about you can't watch the football match, or if you speak to somebody and say you can't go and hear your favourite band play a concert or something of the sort of that nature, that's when people will start to engage with the safety professionals more so than perhaps management teams will.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Great. Well, look, guys, really enjoyed that. I think lots and lots to unpack there, and lots to go away and think about and read about and ponder on. But I'd encourage you, as I just said, to let's take some action on this as well, and let's not look at it as a academic exercise, but as something that we can go away and do. Any final thoughts, Carla, you wanted to share before we wrap it up?
I think one of the things that I wanted to say was about control. And I think sometimes in our lives that we have, that we often think we have more control over what we are doing than we actually do. So that piece on control illusion. And I think if we review that and we have a look at what we're doing and as you said, unpack the way we're doing things, then genuinely I think that we can look at doing things in a slightly different way and actually try to drive things forward to basically to improve risk management. So there's so much that's come out of today. So I've seen some thank yous from people. It's been really lovely. It's gone super fast as well, because so many people it's gone absolutely super fast. But I think that's true. We don't always have as much control over things as we think we do, and we have to rethink ourselves. And Christian, your point about looking at ourselves first and being more self-aware is definitely important. In order for us to influence people, we need to be a different kind of safety professional.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, look, thanks everybody for joining us today. Really enjoyed it, got lots from it, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another Safety Roundtable in a couple